In September 2022, the inflation rate was choking Kenyans at over 10%. Today, as we speak to you, ladies and gentlemen, the inflation is at 2.8%. That is as by November 2025. Ladies and gentlemen, the Kenyan currency is one of the best performing currencies in the world right now. And more, the maize production in the country has increased by 50% since President William Ruto took over. So, by statistics, ladies and gentlemen, President William Ruto should be a real hero. But in 2024, June last year, ladies and gentlemen, his government killed at least 60 people through the bloody parliament that we all know. So today we are posing a question to you. Who is the real Ruto? Is he the economic reformer or the authoritarian president who is ready to push and shoot his way out of criticism? Today we are going fully forensic, no bias and no propaganda, just evidence. Because, ladies and gentlemen, the truth about President William Ruto is more complex, more than either his critics or his supporters want us to admit. Without wasting time, let's dive into it. And if you are here, this is the first time you are joining the podcast, kindly subscribe to this channel, hit the subscription button, smash the notification bell, and also, ladies and gentlemen, press the like button. By doing like that, you help YouTube to notify you when I come to you again. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's start with what Ruto's government has genuinely achieved since they took office, because ignoring these gains and wins, ladies and gentlemen, will automatically make us be dishonest, and dishonesty is our greatest enemy on this channel. Ladies and gentlemen, the first achievement that President William has done in these 3 years of administration is the economic stabilization. And here, ladies and gentlemen, I'm not talking about the government spins that you hear about in political forums, ladies and gentlemen, but here I'm talking about verifiable international recognized metrics that you can find in any internationally recognized assessments, ladies and gentlemen. When Ruto took office in September 2022, he inherited an inflation that was about 9.6%. And as of November this year, ladies and gentlemen, as of November 2024, 2025, it is down to 2.8%, ladies and gentlemen. So the lowest in nearly 2 decades of this country, in the last 2 decades. This is the lowest of our inflation rates in the last 2 decades, ladies and gentlemen. So that's not a small drop in the ocean. That is an economic transformation that President William Ruto has been able to achieve. And for that, we say kudos, Mr. President. Tunasema thank you. Moving on, ladies and gentlemen, the Kenyan shilling strengthened against the dollar from 162 to 129 against the dollar as we are speaking now, making it one of the best performing currencies globally, ladies and gentlemen. Foreign reserves also jumped from 6 billion to 10 billion dollars in his short period of administration. Import cover extended, ladies and gentlemen, from 2.5 to 4 months. Kenya is now Africa's 6th largest economy as we are speaking today. In terms of healthcare, ladies and gentlemen, since October 2024, the statistics has it that 23 million Kenyans are already registered with SHA, the Social Health Authority, and that the system has already paid out 43 billion in claims for about 4.5 million Kenyans who have sought treatment in various health facilities across the country, ladies and gentlemen. And also, as per the statistics, initially, cancer treatment cover was up to 550,000 per year. But with President Ruto's administration, this has increased to 800,000 shillings per year. This is in support of those ailing from terminal illnesses like cancer. Let's talk about agriculture, ladies and gentlemen. agriculture is the backdrop and the backbone of Kenya's economy, and we all understand that. This economy, since President William Ruto took over, it has seen maize production jump from 44 million bucks, that was in 2022, ladies and gentlemen, to about 67 million bucks in 2024. How, ladies and gentlemen? The government distributed 21 million bucks of subsidized fertilizers, as we all know. This cut the price by two-thirds and saving farmers around 105 billion shillings. Ladies and gentlemen, the affordable housing program has completed 11,000 units with about 150 planned to be completed. And this program also, ladies and gentlemen, it has offered 250,000 job opportunities across the country. In the education sector, ladies and gentlemen, education spending has increased from 490 billion to over 700 billion shillings. Ladies and gentlemen, we are talking about internationally verified metrics. This is not tactics. This is not in support of William Ruto. This is the truth. This is what is your normal politicians are not telling you. Ladies and gentlemen, there aren't trivial achievements. These are big achievements, as you have already seen, ladies and gentlemen. So by objective, the economic measures under President William Ruto's first 2 years has delivered significant gains to the country, ladies and gentlemen. So why are Kenyans still angry, ladies and gentlemen? Why did the Kenyans then move to the streets? Why did they go to the protests? And why did so many die in the bloody parliament, ladies and gentlemen? The answer is right here, because economics aren't everything, ladies and gentlemen. And what happened next actually revealed the very dark reality that this government was not aware. In June 2024, ladies and gentlemen, Parliament wanted to pass the Finance Bill 2024, and in that bill, ladies and gentlemen, new taxes that had been proposed would have made life of Kenyans harder for already struggling Kenyans at that time. Remember, as I mentioned earlier, when President William Ruto took over, the economy was doing bad. And when the economy is doing bad, Kenyans were struggling. And therefore, ladies and gentlemen, the Gen Z generation raised on social media, ladies and gentlemen, and those generation was sick of corruption. They organized, and thousands took to the streets. Most protests, ladies and gentlemen, as we also were peaceful, but in some instances, some protests were marred with violence and destruction of properties, ladies and gentlemen. So the government response, how did it respond? Ladies and gentlemen, the government responded by live ammunition, tear gas, and water cannons, ladies and gentlemen. By the end of it all, we saw at least 60 Kenyans dying on the streets in the bloody parliament. 60 were killed by its own government for protesting, ladies and gentlemen. And here, what makes this especially chilling is that Ruto himself told police to shoot the protesters in the leg if they if they damaged property. Ladies and gentlemen, this is on record. That's why I told you we are giving you statistics that are internationally verifiable. Think about that, ladies and gentlemen. The president on record giving orders to shoot citizens. That has never happened anywhere in the world, only in Kenya and only under the administration of President William Ruto. Ladies and gentlemen, but it did not stop there in June. So when protesters actually marked 1 year anniversary, you all remember recently in June 2025, also security forces killed at least 16 more people. Over 400 were injured this year 2025, ladies and gentlemen. So Kenya National Commission on Human Rights has documented over 83 cases, ladies and gentlemen, of abduction in the country and enforced disappearances since June 2024. People criticizing the government online just disappear, ladies and gentlemen, without knowing where they are. Some have never returned. This is not speculation, ladies and gentlemen. This is documented by the Kenya Human Rights Commission, and you can check this information on their website, ladies and gentlemen. So, yes, we are proud that the inflation is down. We are proud that the shilling is stronger, ladies and gentlemen. But 60 plus families buried their children for exercising their democratic rights to protest. Can you put a price to that, ladies and gentlemen? And should we actually go ahead and celebrate the economic recovery that is built on bloodsheds and fear? And then there is the corruption, ladies and gentlemen. In early 2025, the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project ranked President William Ruto as the second most corrupt person of the year. He came second only to Syria's Bashar al-Assad. Let that sink in, ladies and gentlemen, that President Ruto was ranked second corrupt person worldwide. Coming second to who? Coming second to Syria's President Bashar al-Assad. And I want you to let that sink in very, very, very correctly. And about the smoking gun, ladies and gentlemen, there was a series of deals worth $2.6 billion with the famously known Indian Adani Group for airport operations and power transmission, ladies and gentlemen. Now, infrastructure deals aren't inherently corrupt, but here's what makes this different. One, ladies and gentlemen, no public tender. There were privately initiated proposals, basically bypassing competitive bidding, which is one of the requirements by law when you're giving out tenders in this country, ladies and gentlemen. Two, the Adani Group was already under investigation for frauds in multiple countries, South Africa and America being among them. Ladies and gentlemen, number three, President William Ruto only cancelled the deal after Adani founder was indicated by US authorities for bribery, not before. After the US raised alarm on the conduct of Adani Group, that's when our able president cancelled that deal. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm talking about things that are internationally verifiable, truth that is documented, not rumors, ladies and gentlemen. This is a man who actually campaigned as the hustler champion, ladies and gentlemen, someone who understood the struggles of the ordinary citizens of the Republic of Kenya, yet he was ready, ladies and gentlemen, to hand billions in no-bid contract to a controversial foreign corporation, ladies and gentlemen, until the international pressure forced him to halt. And the Adani scandal isn't isolated, ladies and gentlemen. This is a pattern, okay? We know, and we can all remember, ladies and gentlemen, the campaign. Ruto versus the political dynasties, the dynasties, wale matajiri. You remember the wheelbarrow symbol, ladies and gentlemen, representing the common worker. The promises to uplift the hustler, ladies and gentlemen. So the reality check, ladies and gentlemen, despite 5% GDP growth, Kenya created only, I want you to mark, underline the word only, 782,300 new jobs in 2024, down from 848,100 the previous year before President William took over. So the fewest since 2020, ladies and gentlemen, pandemic. The fewest jobs that have been created in this country called Kenya is the William Ruto 782,300 new jobs that has been created. So the economy is growing, yes, But ordinary Kenyans aren't feeling it, ladies and gentlemen. Meanwhile, President William Ruto, ladies and gentlemen, has changed his cabinet 4 times. We all know this. Each time promising reforms, each time the same problem, the same crisis, have identified the common denominator. It is him, ladies and gentlemen. He is the problem. And perhaps most cynically, ladies and gentlemen, Ruto invited his main opponent, Raila Odinga, and his party members into the cabinet. We all know this, and it's in the public domain. So critics call this broad-based and bread-based government, meaning Odinga was brought off. Now the results, no meaningful opposition and no accountability. We all know uh, where there is no meaningful opposition, of course, there is no accountability. And that is something that we should all appreciate and understand. So here is the complicated truth about President William Ruto that I would like you to know, ladies and gentlemen. Number one, he inherited an economy in crisis and stabilized it. That one is a truth that we cannot deny and we cannot run out, that the economy of the Kenya has been stabilized by President William Ruto from a 10% inflation rate to 2.8 as we're speaking now. So inflation is down. So the currency is stronger as we speak right now, 129 against the dollar. So the healthcare has expanded, yes, but here is what we have is what where we still have problems, because from the ground, when citizens are going to be treated at various hospitals, at times they are asked to top up an amount to make sure that their bill is fully paid. This is in contradiction with what President William Ruto has always encouraged Kenyans to call the police when they are asked to pay a penny in hospital. Agriculture has improved. That one is a tick for President William Ruto. There are real achievements that have helped real people. Like the agriculture, we do not have food problems anymore. There are a lot of maize. We don't hear about the maize scarcity in the country like we used to hear. So he also ordered security forces to shoot protesters in the lake. This is on record. And at least 60 people died for demanding accountability on his side. Ladies and gentlemen, over 80 have been abducted and disappeared. He pursued corrupt deals worth billions until the international community pressure was growing out of control is when he had to stop, ladies and gentlemen. He promised to champion hustler, but has delivered wastage and looting. He eliminated political opposition through cooperation, like the way the ODM party, which was the main opposition party, went to dine with him in government, leaving the people without a person who can force the government for accountability. Democracy is backsliding at a very high rate, ladies and gentlemen. The question isn't whether President William Ruto has achieved anything. The real question isn't about whether Ruto has achievements. He does. That one is, yes, he does. He has achievements. The question is, at what cost does he has these achievements, ladies and gentlemen? Can you celebrate, however, inflation while families are burying their loved ones in high numbers like 60 plus? Can you praise economic growth while activists disappear night and day? Ladies and gentlemen, can you call yourself a Democrat while shooting citizens who criticize your government? Ladies and gentlemen, I'm giving you these statistics so that you can add up and see whether they make sense or not. Kenya deserves better than this false choice. Ladies and gentlemen, you should have chosen between economic stability and basic human rights, between development and democracy. Ladies and gentlemen, between prosperity and justice for the people of the Republic of Kenya. Ruto's strategy, ladies and gentlemen, is in that he is failed at everything. His strategy is, however, is that he has shown that he can govern effectively economically, ladies and gentlemen. But he chooses to govern violently and corruptly, politically, ladies and gentlemen. And that might be even more damning as we are speaking to you this afternoon. The Hustler president was supposed to be different from the president that we have right now. Instead, he proven that when power is threatened, even hustlers become autocrats, ladies and gentlemen. And that's not opinion. That is not opinion, ladies and gentlemen. That is the evidence that is there in the public domain. And this information I've given here can be internationally verified. If this analysis, ladies and gentlemen, was valuable, I want you to go ahead and hit that subscription button, because we do deep dives like this every week on Africa's politics, cutting through propaganda from side to side. Drop a comment in the comment section, ladies and gentlemen. Ruto economic achievements outweigh his human right failure? Or is that even the right question to ask? All sources and citations are in the pinned comment below. I don't ask you to trust me, but I ask you to verify for yourself, ladies and gentlemen. I am yours, Jacob Nyende, and this is, of course, the factual analysis. See you next week in our next analysis.